Before starting a new multi-part series about a quadruple restaurant homicide, we decided to have a conversation with one of our favorite people in the true crime community, Bones of Autumn. Bones is a Redditor based in Indiana who researches and writes about a variety of crimes from years past. Áine and I first found her work on the Unresolved mystery subreddit, and soon became major fans. We will include links to her articles that we mention in our show notes. Feel free to take a gander at those as you listen along. We got curious about how she discovered a previously unknown serial killer, how she finds such bizarre cases, and how she manages to conduct such amazing research. So we decided to find out. This week, on the Murder Sheet, part 1 of our talk with Bones of Autumn.
My name is Áine Cain.
And I'm Kevin Greenlee.
And this is The Murder Sheet, a weekly true crime podcast.
Áine and I connected over the Burger Chef murders, a 1978 unsolved case involving the killings of 4 young restaurant employees.
Now we're looking to track restaurant homicides. To help us understand the patterns of these crimes, we created a spreadsheet of nearly 1,000 eatery-related killings, the Murder Sheet. We'll be drawing on that data throughout Season 1 to give you a deep dive into undercovered crimes.
We don't just rely on skimming the headlines. We dive into these cases to bring you in-depth coverage. We're the Murder Sheet, and this is Reporting from Reddit, an interview with Bones of Autumn, Part 1. What got you interested in true crime?
I have been interested in true crime for a long time. I would say it probably started when I was around 10 or so, and I started watching the show Unsolved Mysteries on television. I can remember falling asleep multiple times listening to Robert Stack's voice. And back then, it was more of it was entertainment to me in a way. I was interested in everything, and of course, I felt for the victims on there, but I was young, and to me, they were just interesting things to watch. But then Columbine actually happened, and it was all over the news, and I was just glued to the television. I couldn't believe something like that had happened, and it was just so much coverage of it. I guess back then I hadn't ever seen anything like that, and I think at that point it kind of started me down the path of more wanting to understand why the things happened that they did. And I honestly just stayed hooked to true crime after that. I think when I got a little bit older, I realized that they weren't just entertaining stories. They were actual real life things that happened to real people. And at that point, I decided I want to do something to, kind of help with this. But I have no background in law enforcement or forensics or any of the major things that most of these people do that write about these cases. And so I figured, well, I'm an okay writer and I actually love research, so maybe I could write these people's stories as a way to not only remember them, but to keep the cases that aren't seen on the news frequently in the public's eye in a way. And I had no idea that it would be so successful on Reddit, but that's the place that I chose to share the stories.
Yeah, you really are a great writer and a researcher. Can I ask if you had any background in writing or research?
I took a few journalism classes in college at Indiana State University. But other than that, honestly, I just have always liked to write. It was never like an official, I don't have a degree in journalism or anything like that. I'm kind of a nerd for research. I enjoy it very much. I love looking back in old past things, and I figured I could probably look up a few things about these cases. And now that has turned into me constantly combing through the newspaper archives and using my library's microfilm selection and going to the county clerk's office, using Ancestry, all those good sites like that. That's where I get most of my research from. But I say that it's very important to me that I not only tell these stories well and respectfully, but also tell them accurately. And as I'm sure you guys know, the newspapers are not always 100% accurate. So I don't rely solely on newspaper archives, but they are the big part of my research comes from scrolling through endless pages of newspapers.
We definitely know that feeling.
Sometimes it's very frustrating using just the newspaper archives. A lot of cases there isn't any other information out there about them, and so you have to rely on the newspapers for what you can find. And there'll be 5 or 6 articles, and every single one of them have facts that are conflicting with one another. So it's always important for me when I do share stories like those to say, according to the newspapers, this is what I have gathered on this. But other than knowing for a fact that either the person is still missing or the crime hasn't been solved, I always make sure I tell everybody, I've done the best I can with the research, but I can't tell you for sure that all of these facts are 100% accurate, as they did come from, the newspapers. So, but after I started using the newspapers and got more comfortable with talking to actual law enforcement and county clerks and things like that, I have been able to more thoroughly research the cases. They help tremendously with these old cases, and those are the ones that I cover mostly. If you guys have read some of my stuff on there, I try to pick the cases that aren't just out in the news all the time. There's a few that are quite, I don't want to say popular, but that everybody knows from Indiana, we'll say. And I think those are just as important, but the ones that I like to write about are ones that I don't want to say have been forgotten, that's not a good word, but that have more or less been forgotten over time, and that they didn't really get their time in the spotlight to be solved. Those are my particular favorite ones to cover.
How do you find those cases?
Lots and lots of time spent scrolling through the newspapers. Really, I wish I had a better answer than that. I was telling myself when you guys were going to call, I was thinking I'm not going to sound professional at all because I have no background in anything with this, but it is honestly hours of just scrolling through old newspapers. I'll find a mention of somebody, being murdered or somebody's gone missing, and I'll take that name and plug it into databases and see what I can find, if their case has been solved, if it hasn't, updates on the case, things like that, and I go from there. I use Ancestry a lot. Ancestry is a good source for that, but Names has been great. They actually are wonderful, and so is Redgrave Research. They're an amazing group, and they've helped with a few of my case write-ups. They're great researchers, and they've pointed me in the right direction numerous times. So big shout out to them. But the cases that I cover are so hard to find information about that sometimes I can't even do a write-up about them. I have so many saved that just have nothing about them because there just isn't information out there about them. And those ones always make me sad that I can't find enough info to even put a word out there about it. But I try my best to try to pick the ones that are not covered a whole lot.
From start to finish, how long would you say it typically takes you to do one of your case write-ups?
Oh my gosh, that would depend greatly on the case. Occasionally, I will find one that has just a plethora of information hidden away about it, and when that happens, I can normally get a case written in 2 days or so. It takes me about 2 days to find everything I need to do the write-up. But for the more deep ones, we'll say, those ones have taken me a while. I think probably the longest I have spent working on a case was probably Frank Lever or Ted Carr, one of those two, because there was just a rabbit hole of information going. I still am finding out new things even after all this time, and that's been almost a year in the making at this point.
Yeah, we actually wanted to talk to you about both those cases. The Frank Lever case, it was really amazing how you were able to basically identify a previously unknown serial killer. Can you tell us about that?
Now, of course, that is just what I believe he is. He is allegedly. I can't say for certain, but I actually found him by finding his arrest notification newspaper. And what stuck out to me was the woman that he had been arrested for murdering. Her murder was very gruesome. It was a horrible, horrible death. And I remembered reading about a case in the newspapers that had been a few years before that, but it had a very similar MO. And I thought, I wonder if those could be connected. And I started looking back in the newspapers, and I found another one and another one and another one, and they all seemed to have the same MO, the same area. Most of them were found within 10 miles of each other or so. And eventually, it developed into me figuring out that I think that this man is the one responsible for all of these cases.
It was really an amazing piece of research. Can you tell us some of the details about the MOs that caught your eye?
I would say mostly it was the fact that a lot of his victims, where they were found, that was the big dead giveaway for me. They were mostly taken from Kentucky, abducted from Kentucky, and left in Indiana. Now, they had identified all of the women, and they all worked relatively the same jobs. Most of them were waitresses or just very similar in age and their location. He also, his method of killing them was very brutal. He would, I don't know what all I could say on here. Most of the time, his victims would be found nude, and that it was kind of a hint in the right direction that he could be responsible for all of them as well. Talking about these cases sometimes with people, I'm not sure how much detail to go into with with some of them.
You can go into as much detail.
They were all very violent deaths. And in particular, one was a woman that he had dated at one point. I learned through lots of old comments on things from when she was killed, actually. But that was a big giveaway for that particular person, that she had dated this man and then been found deceased in a river nearby where she had lived and after dating Frank. So that one was pretty obvious. And then when he was arrested for killing Anita, his crimes almost seemed as though they started out rather not mild, because they've never been mild, but they progressively got more aggressive as he went on. And Anita was the worst in the worst shape when they discovered her body. He had amputated her left breast. He had amputated parts of her vaginal region, and then he strangled her to death. And so it was almost a culmination of everything that he had strangled victims before. He had done minor things to victims before, but I think with Anita was his ultimate big murder that he had planned to do. But leading up to it, the other victims, I think, were almost him just trying out what he wanted to do, as awful as that sounds. He was a very disturbed man, and I honestly believe that he may be responsible for several other murders around the area, but I haven't been able to completely link him to those ones, so I did not include them in the write-up on my Reddit page.
What happened to Frank?
Frank was arrested, and he went to jail, and I believe he died in jail.
And you said you're still getting information on this story?
I've still been digging around for information on this story. I had a woman message me on Reddit who claimed that she actually knew Frank, and she sent me a picture of her and him together when they were younger, which confirmed that this was not just another person sending me a message claiming they know somebody out of one of my write-ups. And she told me that he was a very violent man and that a woman had gone missing for several days around where they lived at the time and was eventually found deceased on the side of the road, and she was nude when she was found. And that immediately, set off alarms in my head. Of course, if Frank had known this woman in any way, then he definitely could be responsible for it. But the police in that area are very tight-lipped on that one, and all they would tell me is that it is an open investigation and that they had no suspects in the case. So I couldn't find out enough yet to put that together all the way. The woman doesn't want her name or picture out there, and so I can't use her as a source, and I don't like putting things out there that I can't prove. So I'm slowly adding to the case, and hopefully eventually I will have enough information to do a really thorough write-up for everybody to read about Frank.
Let's take a quick break from the murder sheet to tell you about a podcast investigating yet another unforgettable crime. The Orange Tree is a 7-part series about a 2005 homicide that happened near the University of Texas at Austin. The murder of 21-year-old Jennifer Cave, who was shot, dismembered, and left in a bathtub at her friend Colton Petoniak's apartment, continues to haunt the area to this day.
Like the Burger Chef murders, this case features plenty of twists and turns, including Colton's flight to Mexico with another UT student, Laura Hall. Both were later convicted in connection with the crime, although Colton has continued to appeal his verdict and claim innocence. The business student turned convicted murderer now says that he doesn't even remember much about the night Jennifer died.
The Orange Tree is reported on and produced by Haley Butler and Tue Thomas, who were both seniors at the University of Texas when they started this project. Together, Haley and Tue strive to piece together this tragic story in an in-depth podcast that features audio from courtroom scenes and interrogation rooms, prison phone calls, and exclusive interviews with both the perpetrators and the victim's family. You can binge all 7 episodes of The Orange Tree today on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen to podcasts. And now, back to the murder sheet. As somebody who covers so many of these lesser-known crimes, do you have any thoughts on why some of these crimes, which are very interesting, obviously important, human beings lost their lives, unfortunately, in horrible ways, why they don't attract as much attention, and that why some crimes kind of really do dominate a lot of the discourse? I guess, do you have any thoughts on that?
I would say that it's mostly, it's different for every case, I'll say. Some of the cases I feel they didn't get covered because maybe the life the person led, that the victim led, wasn't seen as a conventional life, and a lot of people would call it high-risk lifestyles. Anybody that was involved with drugs or prostitution or things like that, I think they kind of put those people down a level from the people that are sober and hardworking, and in my opinion, lots of people make mistakes, and that doesn't mean that they deserve to be murdered and that their cases don't deserve to be solved. And I'm sure that I'm not saying that all police work is, the police do an excellent job. They really do. But they also don't have the time for some of these cases. Some of these people had no family. And so nobody is actively pursuing justice for them because they don't have anybody left to pursue justice for them. And so it's been put on the back burner for the families that are more adamant about trying to find their loved one's killer. But that's not always the case. Occasionally there's still families that are looking, and the person didn't get very much coverage because of their age, for instance. A lot of people see that an elderly woman has been stabbed to death in her home, and they think, well, at least she got to live a long life. Hope they find the guy responsible, and then that's kind of the end of it there. I think it's more focused on, your economic status, your job, things like that. So many things I think play a role in where the case gets put as priority, which is really sad, but it's also true.
I was wondering, before we get into other specific cases, you've covered so many cases. Are there like patterns that you see coming up again and again?
Patterns as far as why they're still unsolved.
Yeah.
Most of them, I would say, happened in smaller towns. A lot of the cases I cover too are from, the 60s, 70s, 80s. And a lot of those small towns wanted to kind of keep these things hush-hush because they didn't want to appear as anything other than a completely safe small town. And it didn't want to scare everybody in a way, I think is a good way to put it. But I also think that when they run out of suspects and cases went cold back then, that was kind of the end of it. They couldn't, it couldn't be solved, and so it was just dropped out of the history books in a way, until, of course, I try to find them and kind of revamp them and let people know that these cases haven't been solved yet. And it's not like I think that by writing these stories, I'm going to solve them. I'm in no way an armchair detective, as people like to say, or, a sleuth. I'm not at the police stations, asking them for information on open cases constantly or anything like that. I feel that if I tell these victims' stories, at the very least, it'll help them be remembered and help the public to see that these cases haven't been solved and that they shouldn't be forgotten just because of a passage of time.
And that's very interesting. You talked about how you were contacted by somebody who knew Lever. I'm just curious, have you been contacted by anyone who is connected to any of the victims you've written about?
I have had several families contact me, and most of them are very kind and tell me thank you very much for doing the write-up about their loved one. If possible, I actually prefer to ask permission from a victim's family before I do a write-up, not only to make sure that they would want this out there, but to make sure that I'm doing it in a way that is respectful to the victim and to the families. But occasionally, we will have somebody that will not appreciate that I wrote about their loved one on Reddit. I think that a lot of the families that have an issue with it are simply because it is on a social media platform, and to them it probably appears as though it's entertaining for people to sit and discuss what could have happened to their loved one. And some of the theories that are written on there, or some of the things that they say about their loved ones on there, are not always particularly kind. So I can understand their frustration out of something like that. And if that does happen, I immediately remove the write-up. I will not leave a write-up up that makes any victim's family feel uncomfortable. But for the most part, they seem to be very happy that somebody is covering a case that hasn't been mentioned in 10, 20 years in any type of news outlet or print media even.
At this point, I mean, your Reddit posts have gotten so much buzz. Do you get requests from family members or even other folks who are interested in lesser known cases? Like, hey, can you look at this one?
I normally get one a day that sends me either they'll send me a very small a link to a random unsolved case, or they'll send me a 20-page message from telling me how they know this person, that they're a family member, and that they would really like to see this case covered. A lot of these people, though, are from out of the state of Indiana, and I have covered several cases that are not Indiana cases. I've done some out of Illinois and most recently one from Ohio, but I prefer to stick to Indiana cases, so I like to try to direct them to another writer on the sub that maybe focuses on a more wide range of states. We have some excellent writers on unresolved mysteries, and a lot of them focus on particular states, their home state, but there's a few that cover just such a huge range and are just excellent at researching. I feel most comfortable doing Indiana cases because it's where I'm from. I'm local to the area, and it's my home state, so it kind of holds a special purpose for me to work on these cases from here.
And then I'm curious. So Kevin and I, full disclosure, we moved from Brooklyn to Indiana. Kevin's from Indiana. I'm not. But we also met working on the Burger Chef case, which is obviously one of the more well-known Indiana cases that have gone unsolved.
Right.
But so we always have a lot of discussions on Indiana crime, and I'm curious to get your take on it. Do you have a sense that Indiana is different in any way, from neighboring states? Like, does it seem to have had a large spate of murders in the 60s and 70s, or do you kind of sort of attribute that to just the crime wave that happened in the United States at the time?
I want to say that it's both, honestly. The crime waves that were going on back then were not limited to Indiana by any means. But Indiana has a great appeal for murderers, I believe, because of all the places that you can dump somebody out here. Indiana is so rural, particularly where I live. I live in southern Indiana, and there's more trees than there is pavement out here. And so out here, it seems maybe they thought they could get away with it more often here because given how rural the state is. But honestly, I would have to say that more or less, it is just I happen to cover a lot of Indiana cases, so I'll see mentioned on the sub all the time, why is it always from Indiana? But when you go back and you try to look from, if you look at any state from back then, I'm sure every one of them has a ridiculous amount of unsolved murders. I just happen to focus primarily on Indiana, so it probably appears that Indiana was chock full of serial killers and murderers all the time. But I don't think that that's always the case.
What was in the water back then?
Right, exactly.
Thanks again to Bones of Autumn. Please join us again next week as our conversation with Bones concludes. We will talk about the disappearance of Lauren Spearer, a little-known serial killer, and the bizarre case of a mysterious message scrawled on a chalkboard near a dead body. And a quick personal note. We love reading all your emails and comments, but want to give you a heads up that we may be slow to respond next month until we get back from our honeymoon in late June. Just know that if you experience a delayed response, we are not ignoring you, and we'll get back to you as soon as we can. Thanks for listening to this episode of The Murder Sheet. As always, thanks to Kevin Tyler Greenlee, who composed the music for The Murder Sheet, and who you can find on the web at kevintg.com.
To keep up with the latest on The Murder Sheet, please make sure to follow us on Instagram and Twitter at Murder Sheet, and on Facebook at MSheet Podcast, or by searching Murder Sheet. If you enjoy listening to The Murder Sheet, please leave us a 5-star review to help us gain more exposure. And send tips, suggestions, and feedback to murdersheet@gmail.com. Thanks so much for listening.